Everybody knows the name Richard Nixon, and everybody knows the name Watergate. But what exactly is Watergate? Let's find out. Watergate. What is Watergate? Well, the word Watergate itself refers to a set of buildings, offices, hotels, stores, restaurants in the Washington, D.C. area. So when people say Watergate, the word actually just means a bunch of buildings in Washington, D.C. But it has come to stand for one of the most famous political scandals in American history. It all started when somebody broke into the offices of the Democratic Party. There were a group of men who busted into these offices, tried to copy or steal some papers, and left a bug, a wiretap, a device to intercept phone calls and listen to phone calls that nobody's supposed to be able to listen to. Um, this was during the campaign election of 1972, and the Democrat headquarters obviously was where the campaign was being plotted or organized for the Democrats. So the suspicion immediately was directed towards the opponents of the Democrats, the Republicans. The 1972 election was one that Nixon, as Republican incumbent, was going to win by a landslide no matter what happened. So this whole thing was really unnecessary. The Republicans could have won in 1972 without doing anything. So why some of them decided to do this dumb trick, we're not sure. But they were stealing files and wiretapping, listening in on phone conversations. Now, who did it? That's the question. And the answer was people who were working for other people who were working for the president, Richard Nixon, and for his campaign. And that's where it really got nasty because it was clear that this was something that happened from a very high level. And this is where Nixon went wrong in that he did not immediately get rid of these guys and fire them and say they did something wrong. Instead, he tried to cover up. And a cover up is a bad thing. First of all, he tells the FBI to back off of these, don't investigate this crime, just look the other way. And then Nixon tried to erase a bunch of tape recordings that had evidence on it. As the investigation continued, it was clear that Nixon was using the IRS, the tax service, to harass his opponents. Right? If you were opposed to Richard Nixon, all of a sudden the tax agency would come after you. Taxes are a political weapon. Finally, there's no way to hide from it. Nixon has to admit, yes, these were his guys, and yes, he ended up doing some unethical things, some illegal things, trying to cover up the crime after they committed it. So, step by step, the Nixon power structure starts to unravel. Some of his top people resign. Some are actually convicted and removed from their political offices, and some, one or two, even sent to jail. And when it's all over, Nixon knows that he has to resign, and that's the end of Nixon's presidency. So the Watergate scandal is actually pretty simple. A bunch of guys working for the Nixon campaign broke into an office of the Democrats. The details are complicated, but the idea is pretty simple. What did we learn from Watergate? Why did Nixon get into so much trouble? There's a couple things going on here. First of all, the media hated Nixon even before Watergate. So there were people who were out to get Nixon. All the reporters, all the newspapers, television news people were opposed to Richard Nixon and were always looking for something bad to say about him. They opposed him for a variety of reasons. He was good for the country, and they didn't want to see America do well. The media often is opposed to the country being strong and healthy. Other things we learned from Watergate. People forgot all the good stuff that Nixon did. He did a lot of good stuff, but he blew it. And so all they remember is the Watergate scandal. Nixon ended the Vietnam War and brought peace. That's a pretty good thing. He helped create a better relationship with China. That's a pretty good thing. Earlier in his career, Richard Nixon had ended one of the most dangerous Soviet spy rings inside the United States. When Richard Nixon was a congressman, they discovered and managed to break up a very dangerous communist Russian spy ring, and so he gets credit for that. But people forget all the good stuff, and all they remember is Watergate. Here's the lesson that a lot of people in politics have learned today. The cover-up is worse than the crime. Nixon got in trouble not because of the crime, not because these guys broke into an office. He got in trouble because he tried to cover it up. If from the very beginning Nixon had said, yes, these guys did something and what they did was wrong and I'm going to fire them and I don't want them to be part of my campaign, it would have been over with in a couple days and nobody would be thinking about it. So the act of covering up the crime was worse than the crime itself. Later presidents learned how to escape blame, okay? So they learned from the lessons of Richard Nixon, okay? President Obama, President Clinton, for example, they did the same things Nixon did. They wiretapped, they had files stolen, they used the IRS, the tax service, to intimidate their political opponents, but they learned how to do it smoother and not get in trouble, okay? They did the same stuff, but they learned how to be good at covering it up, and they also learned how to get the media to be on their side. So the reporters, the newspapers, the TV stations were all in camp with Obama and Clinton and wouldn't reveal the truth about them. All right, good news, though. The good news is that many American presidents have been honest and decent guys, all right? Richard Nixon, Barack Obama, Bill Clinton are the exception to the rule. There's lots of good guys, right? George Washington and Abraham Lincoln, of course, but even more recently in history, we have presidents like Harry S. Truman and Dwight Eisenhower. Great guys, honest guys. There's lots of good presidents. We have Calvin Coolidge and Warren Harding, good guys. So don't get down on politicians. Not all politicians are crooked. Many politicians are honest. All right, the happy ending to the whole thing, all right, we get a new president after Nixon leaves office, Gerald Ford. Gerald Ford turns out to be one of the most honest men who ever lived or who held the presidency. And the slogan, the saying, our long national nightmare is over. Okay, that long national nightmare was Watergate and all the stuff that went on with it. It dragged out months, and months turned into a little bit over 2 years. So it was a long time, and Gerald Ford said the nightmare is over. He became president, and America had a really good president with Gerald Ford, and people knew that the trouble was now behind them. So the Watergate concept is actually very simple. Some guys broke into an office. The details are complicated, but the idea is simple. Problem, the cover-up is worse than the crime. Richard Nixon got himself into big trouble, not because of the crime, but because of the cover-up. Lessons learned by later presidents, they got to be really slick, really sophisticated with their cover-ups. We see that with Clinton, we see that with Obama. But good news, a lot of presidents were actually honest guys, did the right thing. You don't have to worry about scandals or cover-ups. And when it's all over with, the Watergate scandal goes away, Richard Nixon goes away, and we get Gerald Ford, one of the best presidents ever. So the story has a happy ending. See you later. Bye-bye.